I always get told my talks are depressing, so I increasingly start with the conclusions. This was actually in a paper that myself and my colleague Alice Bowes wrote for the Royal Society, for Royal Society Journal a few years ago. And this was in the conclusion. I thought the reviewers would take it out. The reviewers don't normally leave these sorts of things in on science papers. This is not a message of futility, but a wake-up call of where our rose-tinted spectacles have brought us. Real hope, if it is to arise at all, will do so from a bare assessment of the scale of the challenge we now face. And we wrote that because we thought that so many scientists have underplayed what their science is telling them. Because they think, well, we can't say that. It's not politically palatable. And it's not our job as scientists to care what is politically palatable or not. We have to say what comes out of our work, and then it's up to others to interpret it as they see appropriate. So that's my sort of, that's what came out of our paper, our sort of conclusion. It frames a lot of our work. My headline conclusion is that avoiding dangerous climate change was the term that's used increasingly and comes out of a lot of international negotiations. Stabilisation at 2 degrees C, does that mean anything to anyone here, 2 degrees C? There's a lot of shaking hands, a few people know. 2 degrees C is the temperature threshold that's come out of international negotiations between acceptable and dangerous climate change. What is dangerous is not the job of scientists to define. It's the job of civil society through all the messy processes of whatever it is that we do, called politics and society and engagement and riots and protests and the rest of it. So society has determined that this 2 degrees C threshold, above the 2 degrees C rise in temperature, is classified as dangerous. Below that is classified as acceptable. I'm not talking about much of that today, but that is a really important threshold. But it's worth bearing in mind that has been significantly influenced by people like us, the wealthy ones who think we can get away with 2 degrees C. At a 2 degrees C temperature rise, many poor people will die. So everything we do that burns energy, or we must emit CO2, we are killing some poor people, usually in the southern hemisphere. We have never really cared about them in the past, and we probably won't care about them in the future. But they will be dying, and they'll be on our TVs, but we've got to switch channel, so it won't really matter. So it remains a feasible goal of the international community that we can still avoid this if we really wanted to, this threshold. But as I say, it's not really a fair threshold if you're poor and in the southern hemisphere. But only just. We can only just avoid this now. We're on the cusp of failing. And when I'm saying on the cusp, I mean actually, if we're lucky on the science, we're talking about 5 years or so to radically reduce our emissions. So we're not talking about the long term here, and I'll come back to why that is later. And I say just, and I'm saying with economic rather than financial benefits. And some of you here, I'm not very good at speaking other languages, so you have to apologise for my Greek. Oikonomia, which is the background, the basis, the Greek root, or the root of economic. If you look at that in the dictionary, it has nothing to do with money. It's defined as stewardship of the household, the prudent use of resources, that sort of thing. There's no reference to money in the roots for the word economic. And that's where it comes from. And we should remind ourselves of that. The more recent version of it, you'll see if you look in the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary and so forth, the financial term around it is crematistic, which is defined variously as the making of money. And that's what we've done. We've shifted from this idea of living a good life, prudent use of resources, stewardship of the household, stewardship of the planet, to the making of money. Now, we will not be able to do this and deal with climate change, but we will be able to do this one. The original root of economics, we need to wrestle it back from the financiers and from the contemporary economists. Economics is a good thing. It's been taken away from us. The only other foreign word I'll do is here is Friday in Stockholm. This was on, I think it was September the 27th last year. And I don't, again, you may or may not have been aware of it. Hopefully it hit the news to some extent. There's a big report came out of the UN, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It was released in Stockholm, and they get released every sort of 5 to 7 years or so. And so it's a big science report that pulls together all the scientific evidence that's out there. And it offered neither surprise nor solace to our fossil fuel hungry world. So nothing really new comes out of the science reports. And I don't think we should really expect anything new to come out of it because it's science. I mean, it's well understood. The science message for policymakers, business leaders and civil society hasn't changed for 20 years. The first report came out in 1990. We're now in 2014. Nothing has really changed significantly in that 24 years, in that quarter of a century. Nothing has really changed. We knew what to do then. Small adjustments, refinements have occurred, but hey, it's a mature science, so we don't expect revelatory things coming out of that. What has changed, though, is that we've managed to dump 200 billion tons of CO2. That's just a lot of CO2 into the atmosphere. So since we've known about this, we've spewed that much CO2 knowingly into the atmosphere without really any major concern about it. That's just since the last report in 2007. So since 2007, we've put out 200 billion tons of CO2. The emissions now are 60% higher than they were at the time of the first report in 1990 at a global level, 60% higher. So we claim to be concerned about climate change, and our emissions are now higher. and atmospheric levels are higher than they've ever been of CO2 for 800,000 years, which is about 3 times longer than we've been on the planet. Not us individually, but as a species, about 3 times longer. And it may well be that actually it's higher than it's been for several million years. But that's the most conservative number I could find on that. So what are we doing about it? And now I'm going to take the UK context here. We're all in the UK today, and the UK has sort of led the rhetoric on climate change. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, because the rhetoric is an important part you need to go through before you bring about action. But we've had rhetoric for 20-odd years, so we should be having some action. So what action is the UK doing? Well, it's had tax breaks for shale gas development. 75% of the massive shale gas is carbon. Osborne, our wonderful Chancellor, wants to go ahead with 37 gigawatts of new gas-fired power stations. Gigawatts, that's a large power station. 1 gigawatt is a large power station. So 37 large gas-fired power stations. We've had the highest investment in North Sea oil in 2013. We've reopened Scottish coal mines. We're expanding aviations and ports. We've got emission standards on cars have been watered down thanks to BMW and Mercedes. We've rejected any 2030 decarbonisation targets that are worth having. We're planning to remove green taxes from energy bills. We're supporting Arctic exploration for hydrocarbons, because the ice isn't there now because of climate change. So Cameron has said that he wants to be at the forefront of our oil industry supporting the development of the hydrocarbons there. And we've recently opened up a console in Alberta. Anyone knows where Alberta is? It's next to the tar sands, the dirtiest form of fossil fuel you could possibly imagine. So this is the framing of the greenest government ever, driving forward concern about climate change. I want to spend £1.30 on flooding. So that's the sort of UK context. And what we think about this global, and no other country is any better by and large. So we're up there with the rest of the bad ones. The global context. This is taken from that well-known left-wing think tank, the IEA, the International Energy Agency. Now they traditionally have been the orthodox voice of the oil industry, basically, or the hydrocarbon industry. So this is quite interesting that they are far more radical now than they've ever been before, and they've been very much the conservative side of energy. This is from Fatih Birol, their chief economist, but you find these sorts of statements from Fatih and from the director of the organisation repeatedly. When I look at the CO2 data, the trend is perfectly in line with a temperature increase of 6 degrees Celsius, that means by the end of the century, which have devastating consequences for the planet. And today, 6 degrees doesn't sound too bad. Just to give you some framing for that, the difference between a glacial period, when the Earth is covered in ice, significantly, and now is 5 degrees. So what we're talking about is in about 150 years' time, 150 years with the period of time, say from 1950 to the end of this century, we will have made a larger change in the global temperature than you would get between now and a glacial period. Now that's a phenomenal thing for any species to do. And what's more worryingly, we're doing it consciously now. And according to the Jim Yong Kim, the new, well, it's not so new now, it's last year, the president of the World Bank, even at a 4 degrees C temperature rise, there'll be water and food fights everywhere. And I don't think it means custard pies. I think he's actually talking about we'll be killing ourselves and each other for food and water. And I'll come back to that a bit later as we go through this. So what of the Annex 1 countries? If I fall into this language occasionally, apologise. Annex 1 is a fancy academic term, again, that's used in the climate change fraternity to mean basically wealthy countries. They are defined precisely in it. So there's Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 countries, wealthy and less wealthy countries. OECD, not OECD, that sort of split. Well, we are committed to make our fair contribution, and this is taken from the Copenhagen Accord, which we're all signatories to, but David Cameron signed up to something very similar to this again at the Camp David Declaration in May 2012 with Obama and Putin and all the other great and good, to hold the increase in global temperature below 2 degrees Celsius. And I won't go into this much today, but notice it says below. It doesn't say a 50-50 chance of, because that's the threshold between acceptable and dangerous. So imagine when you cross the road, you would generally, I would guess that you always look when you cross the road, particularly in London because it's quite busy. So you don't take a 50-50 chance half the time you look. That would be good for climate change if we did do that, because we'd rapidly reduce our population. So to keep the temperature below 2 degrees Celsius and take action to meet this objective, consistent with science, that's a radical idea, consistent with science, and even more radical on the basis of equity. And we should hold our paymasters to this, because we, as a democracy, repeatedly, and hold our own lives up to it as well, we have signed up to this, and we have done repeatedly year after year after year. So how consistent are these two things? We've signed up to 2 degrees C, and yet we're heading towards 4, 5, or 6 degrees C. So if you start to plot these, now there are a few plots on this. So I like PowerPoint, I like numbers and graphs. So there's not many graphs, there's a couple of graphs, I think, that's it. Billion tons of carbon dioxide up the side, or if you're not interested in numbers, just lots of CO2 up the side, and 1980 to 2050 at the bottom, so some dates at the bottom. And if we say, when were we concerned about climate change? Well, the UN set up its Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 1988, which some of you may remember with Thatcher and John Houghton was the first chair of it. It was all a very big, important sort of development that the world was coming together on this, and the UK was one of the leading countries there. We had a Rare Earth Summit that some of you with grey hair or no hair may remember, 1992. Jules, I think you weren't there, were you? No, okay. Some of us remember that quite. It was a very hopeful event. And really good that the world came together with the major leaders there. Very hopeful. Some great things came out of it, things like Agenda 21 and some work on climate change and biodiversity and so forth. We had the Royal Commission report on environmental pollution about climate change in 2000 in the UK, where David King saying climate change is more dangerous than international terrorism in 2004. We had the Copenhagen Accord in 2009/10 with the Rio Plus 20 event, which some of you hopefully will have heard about, the big event that was in Rio a year and a half ago now. And that was the follow-up to the original Rio. And it's called Rio Plus 20. It's because it's Rio plus 20 years. But I think it was Rio plus 20 billion tons. Because actually, this is a plot of our concern. It's a plot of emissions, but it's also a plot of our concern. Yeah. Or absence. Actually, it's reciprocal of the plot of our concern. Our concern seems to get less and less. So emissions just keep going up, despite the fact we have these events. We talk about these things infinitum. We've had an economic global slowdown recently. And it's probably mostly driven by the West, the recession in the West and the global slowdown overall. Yet emissions have continued to rise. They're rising at rates that are higher than they have done during the Industrial Revolution. So even when we've actually started to see a slowdown in economic activity, the emissions have continued to rise very rapidly indeed. So what are future emissions? Well, we have to think about what we're doing. We lock ourselves, when we build a power station, it's there for 25 to 50 years, maybe even longer. If it's a tidal scheme, it might be there for 100 years. So when we build these things, we're locking the future into those today. Where every power station we build now, if we build 37 gigawatts for George Osborne, they will be there, they're operating for 25 to 50 years, unless we're prepared to strand that as an economic asset. So they're there for 25, 50 years. If we build buildings, how old is this building? I didn't have a look when I came in, but my guess is 150 years old, that sort of age. But a lot of the buildings in London, a lot of the ones that we live in, that we like to live in, are older buildings. So when we build infrastructure, when we put in sewage systems and water systems, when we build our buildings, they are locking the future into using them. If you buy a plane or a ship, they last for 25, 30 years. The designs last for 25 to 30 years. The Boeing 747 was designed in 64, sold in 69, and it's still being made today with considerably more efficient engines, but it's the same plane. If you looked at the Boeing 747 today and one from 1969, they would look the same. Most of us, unless you're a plane geek, wouldn't notice the difference. That means the A380, the new Airbus, the A380, the huge thing that's been built recently, that would be in the skies in 2080 if it followed the same path. Just think about that. So we are locking the future. Jules' new children, when they're born, will be having their children and their grandchildren, and the A380 will still be in the air if it follows the same route as the 747. So I'm just saying that everything we do today affects the future for the next 50 to 100 years, everything we build. So it's really important we change what we do now. So let's assume that we do the best that we reasonably can, that's laid out in all the plans that are put out internationally at the moment. And that's the way we go. That's where emissions are heading now. This is quite optimistic, I have to say. And if those are interested, that means lots and lots of CO2. And then the science tells us, and the science is good on this, but it can't give you precision. It can give you accuracy, but not precision. So that's roughly somewhere at a 4 to 6 degrees C temperature rise over the century. And what matters about climate change, you may have heard about things like we've got an 80% target by 2050 to reduce emissions. Nothing to do with climate change. The only thing that matters about climate change is the amount of CO2 we dump in the atmosphere, the cumulative burden of CO2 that we pump into the atmosphere. It's the area under the curve that matters. And that's fundamental because that changes the time frame, makes it much more urgent that we do something. And there's no debate about that in the science, but it doesn't fit very well with policy. Now that's 2 degrees C. So that's where we're heading in terms of emissions, and that's what we need to do for 2 degrees C. So as you can see, there's a rather large gap between the two. And I'm going to try and focus a little bit on that and the rest of the talk, really. So how do we move from a 4 degrees C framing at the moment, where we're heading, to a 2 degrees C world of mitigation? Firstly, that's a global picture. So if we consider it appropriate, and probably everyone here would, in fact, no one ever says they don't agree with this, but they may not really agree with it under their breath, but they've never said it openly. If we consider it appropriate for poorer nations to have more emission space, enable them to develop and improve their welfare, because in the short term we know that if people use more energy, that improves their welfare. That doesn't happen to us. We don't improve our welfare by using more energy, but for poorer people, we know that's the case. We know that categorically from looking at the numbers and looking at the indices of welfare. Then for wealthier nations, It is difficult to envisage anything other than a planned economic recession. You can see that being very popular, that, can't you? But the bankers have brought that about recently. Being compatible with stabilisation at or below 4 degrees C. So this again came out in one of our papers. Now this was really unpopular. We were told we should change this language. So I tend to use the word degrowth now because it sounds a bit nicer. But whatever you want, there's lots of language around it. But at the end of the day, what we're talking about is consuming less stuff. At least until we have low carbon energy supply in place. Now, I'm focused on climate change. From a sustainability perspective, we might make very cogent, good arguments that we have to continue to consume less stuff than we're consuming now. But from a climate perspective, all we care about is having energy that isn't made from carbon. And if we do that, then we can consume as much energy and as much stuff as we want from a climate perspective. But there are lots of other reasons not to do that. But I'm going to focus on climate change. So until we actually get this stuff in place, then we have to really cut back on what we're consuming. And I'm going to explain why that is today over the next little while. Now, what's important about this is that this bit here is too early for us to do anything with large bits of kit. If you want to build power stations or wind turbines or nuclear power stations, wind turbines, tidal barrage schemes, if you want to convert our cars all to run on different types of fuels and so forth, that is going to take decades. Yeah. So we cannot make a transition to low carbon energy supply in the next 2 decades. We can start to make it, but we can't significantly penetrate the system. So even when you think about electricity in the UK, everyone always talks about nuclear power stations or wind turbines or things like that. But remember that of the energy we consume, only 20% of it is electricity. The other 80% is not electricity. It's gas in our heating systems and it's fuel for our cars and our planes and our ships. And that's very hard to decarbonise. So it's going to take a long time. So that's too early for supply, and therefore we have to reduce demand. There's no way out of that curve but to reduce demand in the short to medium term if we're serious about our commitments on climate change. And that's why that comes down to what we do as individuals immediately, not about the future. Now, the supply bit is really important. We need the wind turbines and all the other grand stuff out there. Those things we need, but they're going to take a while to put in place. So in the meantime, we have to do this whilst putting the infrastructure in place for that and building them as fast as we possibly can. So where does that leave us? For a 50-50 chance of avoiding a 2 degrees C rise, so 50-50 chance of 2 degrees C of dangerous climate change, which you imagine if anything else in your life, would you be prepared to take that risk? A 50-50 chance, and yet that's the one that is at best embedded in most of the literature that's out there. That is closing your eyes every second time you cross the road. Then a typical wealthy nation would have to reduce its emissions at about 10% every single year, year on year on year. 10% until we've got low carbon energy supply in place. And can you imagine that about your own life, reducing your energy consumption by 10% every year? Now, we'd have to do it more than, my guess is we would probably have to do it more than that because we probably earn more than the mode salary in the UK, which is about £17,000 a year. And our emissions relate very much to our income. So we would probably be much more reductions than 10% every single year. Now, that looks very difficult. So let's have a look at a higher future. And when I say 2 to 4, actually we're more likely on a 3 degrees C trajectory anyway. So let's imagine a 4 degrees C future. And a lot of people now are starting to talk about this. First, it gives you a larger carbon budget. In other words, you can puke more CO2 into the atmosphere. So that makes it easier for policymakers. So lower rates of change. So we don't have to make such rapid rates of change. But what's 4 degrees C look like? 4 degrees C is a global average. Most of the planet is covered in oceans, and oceans take a much longer time to warm up. So if you take away the oceans and say, what does that mean on land? That means a 5 to 6 degrees C global increase in temperature on land. This will be by the end of the century, but it could be earlier. The models are, as I said, there's lots of accuracy but not precision. So whether it's 2100 or whether it's 2070 or 2060, we don't really know. But that's not very far away, really. Most of us, with a bit of stem cell research, will be here. I'm hoping to be rock climbing still in 2050. So 5 to 6 on land. Now, what's that mean during the hottest days? Think about that from an extreme point of view. This is some data taken from the Hadley Centre, the UK's premier climate modelers, along with the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and work they did collectively. If you think of the hottest periods of the year, the heat waves, then add these to it, 6 to 8 degrees in China. So imagine during a heat wave in China, adding 6 to 8 degrees in Beijing or Shanghai to the temperature of those cities during a prolonged heat wave. Imagine the one we had in Europe in 2003, where 20 to 30,000 people died of heat exposure of one form or another across Europe, adding to that 8 to 10 degrees warming. So imagine that in London during a heat wave that now is longer. Your tube system isn't working. There's no way you can cool your tube. Your fridges probably aren't going to be working because the cables underground that bring the power to the fridges are cooled by the soil moisture, which at these temperatures, if it's a prolonged heat wave, the soil moisture will evaporate. So your cables can't carry as much power. but at the same time, your air conditioning units and the fridges and all those other things are running really hard to keep your food cool. So the fridges start to go off because it's now starting to get blackouts. The tarmac outside is melting because it was never designed for these temperatures. The tube's not working, and you've got 3 days of food in London. So what do? Yeah, you kill your neighbours and nick their food. I mean, that's the sort of world, even in our sorts of societies, where we rely on Victorian infrastructures in many of our major cities, they're not going to be able to deal with these sorts of changes. And in New York, consider this good or bad news, 10 to 12 degrees C during a heat wave. So these are worlds that are really appalling places to live within. But to some extent, other than in China, I'm less concerned about these because we've done this deliberately. In the low latitudes, this is where I am concerned, a 4 degrees C rise for the poor people of the world is going to mean probably something like a 40% reduction in the staple crops, maize, rice, those sorts of things. So a massive reduction because of the temperature itself, not just because of the water changes in precipitation, mostly because of the temperature. And the population's heading towards 9 billion. And you start to paint all of that. That's a 4 degrees C world. That's where we're heading at the moment, if we're lucky. And that's just a place we can't live. There's a widespread view amongst the science that this is incompatible with organised global community, that we tend to fight when we're faced with these sorts of levels of stresses. It's beyond adaptation for us and for most ecosystems. It will destroy most ecosystems. You know, things like the barrier reef in the Amazon at 4, 5, 6 degrees C, these things would have gone. I mean, we probably wiped out most of the corals anyway, the ones that aren't so deep, the ones that we can actually get to see. So, you know, devastating for most of the planet's ecosystems. New ones will evolve, but they take a long time to evolve, thousands and thousands of years. And it's highly unlikely to be stable. Once we put that much CO2 in the atmosphere and warm the atmosphere up, what you tend to get is you get things like the permafrost melting. 2/3 of Russia is permafrost, and that holds a lot of methane. Methane has a very high global warming potential. In other words, it has more impact than CO2 per molecule, a lot more. And there's lots of methane there. That's already starting to melt, the permafrost and methane go into the atmosphere. So it gets worse and worse, and then we're in irrelevance. The system itself takes over, and we can do nothing about it. So it's sort of Neville shoot on the beach type future. So virtually everyone I know who looks at these issues, either academics or other people that engage it from a sort of societal perspective, would suggest that 4 degrees C should be avoided at all costs. At all costs. My guess is there aren't many economists here, but if you like discount rates, if it's all costs, you can discount it at whatever rate you want. That still means you have to do everything you possibly can. So economists can't wheedle the way out of this with a discount rate. So let's return to 2 degrees C, because I would argue that we have to avoid the other temperatures. What's that mean for people like us, the wealthy folk of the world? 10% reductions every year. That means about a 40% reduction by about 2018. So in the next few years, can we imagine 40% reduction in our energy consumption in our own lives? 70% reduction over the next decade. And basically by 2030, the wealthy parts of the world, like the EU, would have to reduce their emissions by 90-odd%. This isn't just from electricity, from all of our energy consumption. And probably a lot of it from our food as well, but this is focusing on energy. These are non-marginal reductions. These are huge step changes. And they're considered to be impossible with economic growth. So what you hear about is, well, that's impossible. I get hit that regularly. That's impossible. Well, fine. Live at 4 degrees C. Well, that's impossible as well. So, you know, we've stuffed ourselves, basically. We've got this point which is, for me, this is exciting. The future's impossible, which means we can write whatever we like on the white cards. Yeah, because any way we thought about the future in the past probably isn't appropriate. So we actually are starting with a blank piece of paper. That we can't stop ourselves getting there, and when we get there, we can't live there. And that's the position we've got ourselves knowingly into, and where we're heading towards it as fast as in fact, we're accelerating towards it as fast as we possibly can. So we need to think very differently about the world in which we live. So before despairing, the argument is there that it's within that, the future is impossible within our current mindset, within the orthodox way of thinking about things. So we have to think differently, and that's what I'm trying to say a little bit about now. And these are very simple things I'm just pointing out here, some sort of suggestions. Have we got the agency to bring about these unprecedented rates of change? The 3 things I'm going to look at, one on equity, one on technology, and originally I was an engineer, so I spent a lot of my time working in the oil industry, producing the black stuff from the North Sea. So I'm trying to remedy some of the problems I've already caused. But we've all burnt it. So technology, and then yeah. Right, so just going to whip through these quite quickly. Firstly, who are the emitters? Because as I said before, it's a short-term issue, and I'll come back to that as I go through this. There's little chance of changing policies for 7 billion people. There's no UN, there's no international global governance on this, or on anything really. So the question then would be, how many people actually need to make a change? How many of that 7 billion that's going up already, How many of those need to make a change? Now, Vilfredo Pareto, an Italian economist in the good old days, and they're political economists, not the modern types of neoclassicals. The 80-20 rule that came out of that, 80% of something relates to 20% of those involved. And this is it's just a guide. These are just rules of thumb. But if you then looked at that in terms of emissions, 80% of emissions from 20% of the population, that sort of holds quite well across nations. It holds actually quite well across the planet. You then say, well, in that 20% of the population that emit most of the stuff, can you do that again? And yet you find that again. It does appear that in that 20%, the split again is quite similar. If you think of our group, we'll definitely be in the 20%. But in this group itself, you'll see a massive differential about who emits what. So again, that split will occur. And within the people that emit a lot within this group, there's probably quite a large split amongst those as well. If you run that 3 times, 50% of the emissions come from 1% of the world's population. Now, this is just a guide to say, should we go out and test that? When you do go out and test it, and we're trying to do that at the moment, other people have tried to do this, it does seem a reasonable guide. I think more realistically, to say something like 40 to 60% of the emissions come from somewhere about 1 to 5% of the population. It just gives us a flavour that there's a very different, the emissions are hugely skewed to a particular group of people. And then the question then is, have we got a good idea of who these are, so we can tailor the policies towards the high emitters? Well, they're climate scientists, so we know who they are. I often give this talk at universities with some other graphs in it, but anyway, so that's why I use this one. OECD and other academics. So any academic around the planet is basically in that particular group. Could be wrong. That's my guess that I put in late last night. Probably everyone in this room is probably in that group or aspiring to be in it. Anyone who gets on the plane once a year, I want to ask if any of you have been on the plane in the last year, but if you have, then you'll be putting yourself in that group. If you go twice, then you put yourself in the higher and higher emitting groups each time you get on one. That dwarfs everything else you do. For people like us, the flying will dwarf pretty much everything else that we do. 2 degrees C mitigation is principally a short-term issue. It's about now to 2025. So it's mostly about the few, not the many. And you'll hear repeatedly that climate change is about we need to control population. Population is a red herring when it comes to climate change. And the maths on this show it repeatedly. If you just take the mode person, not the average person, the average is always, and the mean is always a skewed number by wealthy people like me sort of bringing it up. If you take the typical person in, say, China, whose emissions are incredibly low and income's low at the moment, and imagine that the Chinese economy trickles down to them at the same rate the economy grows. That has never occurred. Trickle-down economics has never occurred in the history of humankind, but let's imagine it did. Then the poor people in China may be able to buy fridges and cars in 2030. But by then, you've got to have a low-carbon energy supply in place. So climate change is not a population issue, not for 2 degrees C. It is a consumption issue. Sustainability is significantly a population issue. And just think about it from a food perspective. Poor people eat about probably half as much food as we eat, something like that, maybe 2/3 of what we eat. So we don't eat much more than poor people. But in terms of energy, we probably consume 10 or 100 times more energy than poor people. So from a climate perspective, it's a consumption issue. Technology, what can we do? This is just one example here, just very simple things. But I did notice earlier, this fits with this. There's a screen on in there. No one's in there. And the Royal Institute, which does a lot of work on climate change, is having that screen on playing to no one 24 hours a day, unless it switches it off at night, which it probably doesn't. They're the sorts of things. Permanently, there's a TV screen playing in there. So we can see the sort of things that we're doing now that were very easy to stop. But think of the electricity system. If you want refrigeration or light, but imagine refrigeration, tell them what these light bulbs are like here. Then you need some electricity. You need some power cables. You need a power station. You need the Venezuelans or the Colombians or now the Americans because we're buying their coal to get the stuff out of the ground and transport it over here. You start to say, if we want 10 units of useful refrigeration, refrigerators are fairly inefficient. An A-rated fridge uses 85% more energy than an A++ fridge of the same size. 85% more energy. Most people think an A-rated fridge is a good fridge. An A-rated fridge is rubbish. A-rate, A++, 85% less energy. So massive reduction, massive chances to improve efficiency. So you have to, because the things we use are very inefficient, you have to put in lots of electricity to get the useful stuff out. We lose somewhere between 6 to 9% of the energy in the transmission and distribution network. That's the pylons bringing the stuff to us. Mostly the low voltage stuff that goes underground in cities. The pylons are fairly efficient. Power stations are constrained by laws of thermodynamics, are somewhere between 35 and 55% efficient. So most of the energy that goes into a power station goes up the chimney. Not much comes out in electricity, less than half. And then we've got to get the stuff onto ships from America, the coal from America, onto ships, brought over here, put on trains, take it to the power station, and do that every single day for the 40 or 50 years that power station operates. So you start to say that we spend all our time focusing on this, But actually, you look at this, you save 1 unit here, you save 13 units across the whole system. You go in there, turn the TV screen off, and that's gone. So there are huge prospects for doing something here. And most things, whether it's cars, whether it's toasters, or whether it's refrigerators, most of the stuff that we use on the demand side, the technologies, that actually they only last about we tend to replace them significantly within about 8 years. So 80 to 90% of all the vehicle kilometres travelled by cars in the UK are travelled by cars that are under 8 years old, and most of them are travelled by cars that are 3 years or under. So we can very, very rapidly change the energy consumption by making things, use them what's more efficient. The problem is, the Jevons paradox, the rebound, is that we then use that energy to buy jet skis or go on holiday again somewhere else. So any money we save, we spend on more energy. So you have to compensate that. That is not a small issue. That's a huge issue. We're much more efficient now than we were in the 1900s, and yet our consumption keeps going up. So you have to deal with the rebound issues. And the final one, growth. This is a completely misguided proxy. And I wrote this originally for Manchester City Council for their Economic Scrutiny Committee. The head of the council asked me to actually, I never thought about that before, it was just inside that building. I was asked to give a talk to the committee there. Has anyone heard of Nicholas Stern? Nick Stern? Some of you have. Quite well-known, originally an economist, wrote an influential book on climate change. It's slightly concerning to me that only when the science is converted to pounds, pennies and shillings, pounds, shillings and pence, is it actually taken in notice of. The scientists have been saying these things for years, but only when the economists get in there does anyone take any notice. But here, the Committee on Climate Change we have in the UK and others say that reduction rates of over 4% per annum, mitigation means emission reduction, reducing our levels of carbon dioxide emissions. Over 4% per annum is incompatible with economic growth. This is a really common thing that's trotted out. There's no real evidence for it one way or another. But I find what's interesting here is at the same time, the economists that are saying this are the same ones that broadly have been behind the idea of a stalled set of markets. Markets have not been self-regulating. There's a revelation to people. The markets don't self-regulate. And we've pumped in £350 billion. That's a third of our global GDP in the UK into quantitative easing, giving pounds to the banks. And yet we're saying things like this. So there's this huge scope, I think, for revisiting the language that economists have used. I don't know why we take any notes of them anymore. Their own domain has failed. So we have an unprecedented opportunity here to think differently, that we're doing things that we would never have dreamt of doing. Can you imagine going back 5 years and say we're going to take a third of the UK's GDP and hand it over to private banks? I thought you were mad. And yet we've done just that. So we can do things that are mad when it's the banks. So we can do things when it's mad when it comes to climate change. So what I'm saying here is that there are huge things that we can do that are very different to what we've done in the past. And we do those things anyway in other areas. But growth is also a proxy for many social goods. Welfare, health, life expectancy, those sorts of things, employment, income, equity, literacy rates, safety, low crime. These are the things that matter in our lives. No one really gives a damn about growth. These are the things that matter to our lives. In fact, when we started off saying, what's your favourite time in your life? What are you imagining? They aren't the things really that feed into growth. They're the things that feed into these sorts of things. That's what really matters. So let's forget growth. Just bin it. Whether it's bigger or smaller is an irrelevance. Let's improve the things in their real form. Let's measure them and think about them in their real sense. So growth itself has no meaningful value. So to summarise, if we have fairly conservative assumptions here, this is not taken from Greenpeace or Friends of the Earth. This is taken from the sorts of language, the sorts of science that's used by all major governments that comes out of the traditional sort of scientific routes. If science is broadly correct, if physics works, if cumulative emissions, carbon budgets, correlate with temperatures, which, unless physics is completely wrong, it does. If the less wealthy parts of the world can peak their emissions, bring the emissions of China, India, and the rest of the world to a maximum by 2025, if we can reduce the emissions from deforestation and reduce our emissions from food, and that's the second one of those is hugely challenging. Emissions from food are rapidly going up. If there are no discontinuities or tipping points, in other words, the permafrost don't all melt and don't start to change the levels of carbon dioxide and other gases in the atmosphere, and if the economists are right, or the astrologists as I prefer to call them, are right, and a 3 to 4% reduction in emissions is the most that we can achieve, then 2 degrees C stabilisation is virtually impossible, and we're going to head to 4 degrees C by 2050 to 2070, that sort of time frame. So we're putting in those sorts of futures now, if that's what we take. So for policymakers, the message is simple. We have to avoid 4 degrees C at all costs. People like us need to reduce our emissions by about 70% in 10 years. And it's only a small percentage of the global population have got to do that. Again, people like us, those of us that make the policies. Low carbon energy supply is really important it's a prerequisite going forward, but it's too little, too late in the West for us to get ourselves off the curve. That's not to say it's not important, it is, but it's a medium to long-term issue. The principal response is to reduce energy demand now and mind the rebound effect. ultimately, we have to escape the shackles of the 20th century mindset if we are ever to resolve 21st century challenges. And at the moment, we're still stuck in the 19th century mindset at the moment. And this will demand leadership, courage, innovative thinking, engaged teams, and difficult choices. It's not going to be easy to do this. And I'll finish off with my quote, not my quote, Robert Unger's quote, one I always use. At every level, the greatest obstacle to transforming the world is that we lack the clarity and imagination to conceive that it could be different. And that's definitely what we need now is imagination and then clarity of thought around that to understand what the future could be that's a good place for us all to live. And that's that. Thanks very much.